To us. I know you've just done two successive book launches in Johannesburg and Cape Town. What has been the general sentiment to the work that you've done?
I think, well, firstly, good evening and thank you for having me. I think the popular consensus thus far, and that's having traveled between Johannesburg and Cape Town and met quite a few people who turned out to this launch, was shock. Because what Babita's story is truly a tale of woe as concerns one woman who was gunned down brutally by six Izinkabi. And it's a tale of woe because of what she exposed at Tsepiso Hospital, the depth and depravity of the corruption at that facility, which saw 2.3 billion rand extracted through dubious contracts in less than 2 years. And beyond that, the book is my own personal reflection on telling this story. And, I'm very grateful to everyone who came to me with information and risked their lives to help me tell the story.
And we'll get to some of the things that have been unearthed since and the challenges she faced, you face in writing the book. But how did you balance, as you say, the evidence, the documentary aspect of writing the book, including your own responsibility of telling Babita's story? Because I believe you've actually become really close now to the family.
Yes, no, the second part of that first. I'm very grateful to Babita Deokaran's family for letting me in and giving me the privilege of telling the story. And truly, they were incredibly selfless in the way that they gave of their time. I mean, I spent hours with them just listening to their story and their stories of Babita, because it was very challenging to attempt to write a book or tell the story without understanding the person that I'm writing about, because I never had the privilege of meeting her. And beyond that, what the storyline is really underlined by is an unimpeachable trove of digital forensic evidence that we obtained through our investigation at News 24. And that digital evidence is drawn directly from Babita Deokaran's cell phone and her state-issued laptop, and it's a 60,000 email database that it held. And that helped us decode everything.
And you spoke about, at some point you were saying if only you could get hold of the cell phone, but you had the laptop. Just take us through why that was important and what you found, because you mentioned the fact that before she was assassinated, she had been followed, there was witness statements of it, but that she had actually spoken out and said she's afraid not only for her life, but those who knew the information that she passed on.
So when Babita Deokaran was murdered, the motive for that crime was unknown, certainly to us, and I think as well to the police who were investigating it. And we got onto the story at News 24, and it was only 7 or 8 months later, after her murder, that we managed to get access to this laptop. And what it contained was all of her emails, and critically, it was that report into Tsepiso Hospital. And that was the one singular document which essentially got her killed, because in that she flagged 850 million rands worth of payments and called for a forensic investigation and tried to halt 100 million rands worth of outgoing payments. There's several days after she filed that report, she was murdered. And, the import of that evidence for us was incredible, because it underscored our entire investigation, which has been running for 4 years now. And critically, it was evidence which was cast aside by the Hawks. When we examined these devices, we found out that they'd never been imprinted or mirrored by the police, as evidence should be, and they had essentially cast it aside.
Which is a different picture from what you say, the work that the police did, because you mentioned obviously the six Inkabi that were arrested. So at some point there was a chasm. Have you found out what created that gap and why we are where we are now in terms of the family, you yourself still having questions? Because you said, the killers are behind bars, but the masterminds are still out there free.
I think the central issue is critical missteps in the Hawks investigation. And, when we were telling the story, we plot things on a timeline, and we could see that very in the early stages of the investigation, when it was being handled by a provincial unit, a sharp group of cops, they made incredible successes within days. They were able to arrest the six in Kabi. They arrested two other men they linked to the getaway vehicle. And then the Hawks took over the case, and that was strange in it of itself, because the Hawks don't have a mandate to investigate murder unless it's the murder of a policeman. So the Hawks took charge and really just, it made mistake after mistake. The central one, ignoring the digital forensic evidence. And then we later managed to uncover that one of the men that they ended up releasing inexplicably and against protocol, without examining his cell phone or anything else to do with his person, he was actually named as the one who pulled the trigger when his cohorts committed to a plea and sentencing agreement, which saw them go to jail. And so we've now been 4 years since Babita Deokaran's death, and every year about this time around the anniversary, we take stock of where the investigation is. And what we've seen is essentially a cold case develop. The last time people were arrested in connection with Babita Deokaran's murder was 1,465 days ago. And I mean, that no one should be able to accept from law enforcement, which is meant to serve the people.
Which raises the question naturally, is then who is shielding those behind bars and the one who got off free, so to speak. And in tandem, your book, the title is A Shadow State. So can you just expand a little bit more, because it obviously has to do with the trail that you've been able to follow and some of the speculation perhaps that you have?
Well, I think the shadow state is really a device to describe state capture. And that's what Babita found at Tsepiso Hospital. And it's an entire illicit economy that prevents the state from being prosperous, because every tax rand is intercepted before it reaches its final destination. And what I mean by that is that contracts are inflated, or they are completely contrived in an extraction scheme like we saw at Tembisa, to end up benefiting a select group of very wealthy men, and men who happen to be incredibly politically connected. And the shadow state goes beyond that, because then there are those who enable these tenderpreneurs. There are the dubious car dealers, the real estate agents, the lawyers, and the accountants who will help them cover their tracks. So that is the shadow state. So it's about extracting money from the state and then spending it for wealth and opulence, and diverting it from its true intended destination, which are the sick and dying patients, desperately indigent individuals who call on Tsepiso Hospital for medical care. And that's the crux of what this really is. And Babita laid down her life to expose that. And she left behind a teenage daughter, now a woman who is in university. And Babita missed her first day at university. She missed her passing her driver's license and her passing matric. So it's really an example of how corruption cannot ever be considered a victimless crime, because you're not simply a psychopathic individual stealing from a hospital because you think it has bottomless funds, but you took a person away from their family. And that's the cost of corruption personified by Babita Deokaran.
And I guess what I'm getting to more bluntly, Jeff, and I ask this question knowing that you may or may not be able to answer, given the danger that surely you yourself have faced and have been under the pressure. If you could also tell us a little bit more about it. But we know that there are obviously some very powerful people who are instigating running this parallel state. We know that people who lead procurement, people who also have their own political masters or principles, so to speak, are the ones who are benefiting or who are behind it. At this point, we know there was a state capture commission, but nobody's behind bars. Do we know definitively if these people are still running these departments, countries, or entities?
It's hard to say, but let me put it to you this way. So the SIU investigation into these contracts, and it's several thousand purchase orders that they're examining, worth 2.3 billion rand, has now spanned 4 years. At the end of that investigation, they will begin with civil litigation, and they can make recommendations to the NPA to prosecute for instances of fraud and bid rigging. And because that SIU investigation is not yet finished, those recommendations have not been made. And without those recommendations and a prosecution in situ, those suppliers cannot be blacklisted from doing business with the state. And we've seen as recently as 2 or 3 months ago, a key ANC politician in the saga, Selo Sikoko, the chair of the Ekurhuleni region of the now co-governing party, he had 3 companies in business with Tsepiso Hospital. They were amongst the companies that Babita flagged for further investigation. And, you know, it appears that he took a bit of a break from public procurement, at least in the Gauteng Department of Health. But recently, as soon as 3 months ago, he was scoring tenders via the Gauteng Department of Health. And there are many more politically connected figures. But he's one of he's a rich example of what we're talking about when we speak about how politics and patronage and now procurement become completely intertwined with one another.
Obviously, there's been various changes made to the law here in South Africa to protect whistleblowers, but there have been experts, some legal and some political, who have poked holes in the draft of the law or the law itself. From what you know and have seen of the changes practically, including, as I mentioned, what you underwent, whistleblowers, and that includes investigative journalists like yourselves, is the law doing enough to protect them? And I'm also talking about the criminal justice system.
Well, frankly, no, the law is not doing enough, and that's because our legislation is out of date. And as you correctly say, we've seen draft bills, and we're expecting progress later this year. But you know, none of this has actually been realized action. It's simply been talk up to this point. And what we've seen since Babita Deokaran's death is several other assassinations, too many to count, actually. As recently as 3 months ago, in the Ekurhuleni region, in Pomafole, an auditor in that municipality was murdered, and he was the 3rd person in that role to be either shot at or shot and killed. So that tells you about how nothing has really changed. And then I must draw a distinction: investigative journalists are by no means whistleblowers. You know, we choose this path, and it's completely different. Not to slight each's value. But, you know, whistleblowers require a certain protection. And, you know, if I contrast myself with Babita Deokaran, she was lied to and betrayed and ultimately led to her death unwillingly. You know, I understood what I was going into writing the story, and I did so with the full heft of my employer behind me, who gave me every support that they were able to give me.
And it's a very important thing to underscore, Jeff, just to cut in there, because I did want to ask the question that because you've spoken about being tailed, about being threatened, do you have a line that you would draw? I know you've challenged all of us. You said Babita stood for the truth and she was killed for the truth. Is there a point where you would feel that this is becoming a little too dangerous, despite all of the support that you've been getting?
Listen, of course there were times where I was scared. I think any normal person would be, and I think not being scared in a situation where your life and the lives of your loved ones are potentially under threat, that would make you an abnormal individual. So of course there were times where I vacillated, and luckily I have the support of my wife, who stood at my back through everything. And there was ultimately a realization that this was something that was bigger than me, and there was too much value that could be denied to the people of South Africa if we chose to stay silent. And beyond that, I don't like being cowed by people who threaten. And that's what these people want. They want to induce a silence by sending a message. And we cannot accept that. We have to stand against it. And I'm glad that the story was told, because in some ways we could have potentially saved the taxpayer 2.3 billion rand. And that was Babita Deokaran's sacrifice. So we have to advance it beyond just that. It has to be emblematic and symbolic in some way, even if it is advocation for whistleblowers. But from my perspective, it's pursuing everyone linked in these nebulous networks because this investigation is ongoing and there's much more of the story to be told. And I truly believe that we're yet to fully grasp the true scale of these extraction networks and all their connections.
Well, we wish you all the best as you continue with that brave work. And thanks for taking the time to speak to us. Much appreciated. Jeff Wicks, who's written that book about Babita Deokaran, who has paid with her life, as he says. And he is saying, unfortunately, there is a cost to pay, and Babita Deokaran did pay for her integrity, for her truth, but saying that we shouldn't give up, that we should continue to protect truth tellers. Thank you very much, Jeff Wicks, speaking to us about that book that he's launched, just released. It's called The Shadow State, Why Babita Deokaran Had to Die. And that's how we end Africa World Hour this Friday. Thank you so much for joining us. Do enjoy the rest of your viewing and listening here on Channel Africa, and do enjoy the rest of your weekend as well. Up next is African Diaries with Shayla and Kumana.